Okay, yeah, we're about recording. There's an old adage that states that cultural critics are failed artists. I don't wholly agree with this statement, as criticism is a skill just as any that produces the art it covers. In fact, many of our best critics are those who have dedicated their careers to honing their skills, instead of as an aside to their true intentions. But I do somewhat agree that criticism is often a means for an artist to find their own voice. By approaching a work with an analytical eye, the truths behind its beauty may manifest, and those lessons can be applied to one's own creations. All of this is to say then that when I started this channel with the intent of reviewing video games with a more analytical bent, there may have been an ulterior motive beyond just entertaining an audience and improving my video editing skills. This might have been obvious, as rather than review a lot of different games, I've usually stuck to ones I either have a long time fondness for, or were keen to try. Granted, in the years since, I've broached other subject matters with the channel, which have led to other creative pursuits. For example, Quest and Show. For a few weeks out of a year, I get to play Dungeon Master to a revolving cast of guests, and together we create an adventure that slowly creates a larger story. Quest and Show has been a means for me to improve as a storyteller, entertainer, and game designer, and it just so happens my training could be packaged as a podcast hopefully anyone can enjoy. But before Quest and Show, and even before the creation of the channel, I had a different long-term project, one whose difficult production would set me on the path I'm on today. Because in order to fix this project, I needed to know what made great games work. Granted, it might have been a little foolish of me to think that making a few YouTube videos would unlock the secrets of great game design, especially as I'd also have to learn what makes great YouTube videos. Plus, years later, new games and new great ideas have kept cropping up, and I haven't lost my appetite for putting into words why I think so. It's through this channel that I've been able to get the idea from its initial prototypes to something that, well, I'm nearly happy with. And that's been because I've been able to play test it with people I've met through doing YouTube, and even filtered new skills gained from doing the channel into improving its look and feel. With all that out of the way then, why am I making a video about a game that still doesn't tangibly exist? It's because I think it's an interesting case study in when games don't work, and the steps taken to fix that. Sometimes the best analysis comes when one can put themselves in the mind of an artist. And really, what better artist do I know than myself? But can one really know oneself? At least without a lifetime of learning the tools of deconstruction. I tried to do that from playing a bunch of video games, and doing a roleplay podcast, as well as reading a few books and studying others, I suppose. Am I really prepared to get to the bottom of why my beautiful unfinished baby was left unfinished? Especially when I couldn't do so in a script I wrote all the way back in 2019. Well, only one way to find out. Making games isn't easy. I should know. In 2015, I had the brilliant idea of combining two games that I had fallen in love with. Dungeons & Dragons and Talisman, the magical quest game. The former is the premier role-playing adventure game, where amazing stories are created between player and games master, generated in part by dice rolls and character statistics. The latter is similar, except the game master is replaced with a board and cards. And although generating great moments is what makes it memorable, the player's main motivation is to gather enough resources to get the crown of command at the centre of the board. It's essentially a gamified take on Dungeons & Dragons. There's a scoring system in place, and only one player can be considered the winner. As both ideas have a pretty close genesis, what was my intent for combining them together? Well, I like the simplicity of Talisman. Rather than my character having specialised moves, ammunition, and training to track, all I had to worry about was health, strength, and magic points, while still having a special move that gave them something the other players couldn't. Instead of relying on a 20-sided dice to generate an outcome, a more standardised 6-sided dice is used to decide whether a player character defeats a terrible foe, or the outcome of visiting a particular location. For example, heading into an inn, a character may make some coin for a fight, or lose it all by getting drunk. On the flip side, that simplicity comes at the cost of player expression. For one thing, the board can't change, at least without some expensive add-ons. So the idea I came up with was something that was mechanically as simple as Talisman, but had some of the things I liked from D&D, plotting my own course and a little more role-playing. I also wanted something that neither game could do. Have it all fit in a package small enough to be easily deployable. Simple enough for a big group of people to pick up, but with enough depth that they'd want to keep playing. You might have expected, for a channel that mostly covers video games, I wanted to make this project digital. Actually, making a physical game was something I knew could be achieved with the skills I had. Rather than learn computer programming in a game engine, I can instead rely on my knowledge of programs like Adobe Photoshop, Illustrator and InDesign to create all the artwork and rule sets needed for the game. I could even go to a local printer to have prototype cards made for playtesting. So I went to work creating hundreds of monsters, treasures and other things needed for the game. The thing I hit upon immediately was a game generated through cards and dice. The cards would be used to create a player map that the characters traverse through during the game, and track the statistics of the monsters and the treasure that they found. Dice would be used for any uncertain details. How many rooms they could travel through on a turn, what outcome would occur when facing a monster or a strange encounter. Dice rolling could even also decide the winner of a duel between two players. From the initial prototype up until now, this setup has remained a constant. You may have played games like this yourself, as the idea of the card-generated dungeon crawler has been done already in a few places. Granted, when I started the project, I didn't know that, but I kept at it, and did my research to figure out ways I could hone the idea to make it more unique. For one thing, I wouldn't rely on a big expensive box and miniatures, but rather keep things mostly to paper. In fact, the idea initially was that people could print the game out themselves. The initial setup was very straightforward. Players picked a character, then started at the entrance card, and rolled a dice to see who went first. When they wanted to explore, they would draw a card from the room deck and connect it to the entrance via a doorway. In the initial version of the game, room cards were made up of tiles a player character had to traverse with dice rolls, and some tiles were printed with a skull or chest to denote an encounter or treasure. The player would then draw those cards and follow their instructions. For example, if a player drew two monsters, they'd be expected to fight them. The lesson quickly learned through playtesting was that traversing rooms tile by tile was very boring. It was also impossible to track the status of monsters in these rooms. Even if they had all been defeated, the tiles still persisted, unless they were covered up somehow. If the cards were flipped over to denote the room had been cleared, players could no longer see the layouts. There was also another issue. The monsters had been designed like D&D encounters. That meant that they had HP that needed to be whittled down. Some heartier monsters couldn't be defeated on a single turn, but there was no way to see how much HP they had left without someone keeping track. The idea of the game was that it didn't need a GM, and so the players would have to be in charge of that. Quickly, the game had far more tracking to consider than Talisman, so I went back to the drawing board. The second prototype was far more simplified. Room cards, monsters and encounters were combined together, and could be placed in any configuration a player wanted. Instead of monsters having HP that needed to be whittled down, instead they worked like locations in Talisman. Rolling a 6-sided dice decided what would happen during that encounter. Either the monster was defeated and could be pocketed by the player of points, they attacked the player and they'd lose their cards and be sent back to the start, or they'd reach a stalemate and the player's turn would end. The issue with this version was that the players could be caught in a loop of constantly gaining treasures or fighting monsters, punctuated with the more boring empty room cards or one-way intersections that block progress on a map. It had eliminated the need for tracking, but at the cost of any need to think outside of where players wanted to place cards. Again, I went back to the drawing board and attempted to figure out something that met these two ideas in the middle. At this point, I had worked on the project for cumulatively a few weeks. In total, it had been a few months of tweaking the idea in my own time, and scheduling playtests with my friends. The problem at this stage was that I had ideas, but I didn't have one unifying take for the game I wanted. As such, the game ended up languishing as I inevitably moved on to other ideas, and then eventually found myself moving for work. When I returned for the game, it was with a renewed vigour brought on by a new artistic vision for the game. After signing on with some Facebook groups for game design, I had a better idea of what I could do to get the game into shape. For one thing, the black and white pictogram look I had originally considered was replaced with a far more colourful and friendly art style. Oh, that looks shit. The room tiles ended up as simple as my second prototype, but with the choice of the first. The major innovation was that instead of printing everything on the room side, these cards were now double-sided. This meant that whenever an encounter was defeated or a treasure was looted, these cards would flip back over, denoting that they had been cleared. Monsters and treasures too were made a lot more fun than they were initially. No hit points to worry about, but instead just outcomes. And these outcomes could be anything. Sometimes a player didn't take harm, but might miss a turn or lose a piece of treasure. Sometimes, instead of rolling a specific number, they'd have to roll an odd number, or a prime number in order to succeed. They might need to roll higher than a 3 or lower than a 4. One monster in particular forced players to engage in rock paper scissors to decide who won. Also, Alan Packer. Player characters no longer had statistics to worry about, but instead had actual health points. These tokens were the only things players had to track in-game, and essentially let them fight encounters or duel other players as many times as they had these points. They could even roll at the beginning of the game to see how hearty they'd be. At this point, the game had fixed all its issues from the first two prototypes. It was the right amount of tracking that I wanted, meaning players wouldn't be stuck number crunching. Rather, they could explore the dungeon, fight monsters, and loot treasures to their heart's content. Then came an issue I hadn't considered. How did the game end? My initial thought was that once all room cards had been placed, players would then need to return to the dungeon's entrance to cash in their cards to decide who'd be the winner. The problem was there was no motivation to do so. If players wanted, they could just stick around and duel each other to take each other's cards, knowing that anyone who was kicked back to the entrance wouldn't be allowed in. The only motivation to leave was to avoid that fate. But it wasn't much motivation. I had figured out the first two acts of the game, setup and exploring. The issue was now coming up with a conclusion. I attempted to create story cards that flavoured certain parts of the game. For example, giving the objective of finding a member of royalty or defeating a boss to signal the end of the game. And then having all cards flip back over during the finale, or have an enemy on every square. But this didn't fix the issue. So once again, the idea ended up languishing. Rather than let myself be defeated by a lack of ideas, I decided to start figuring out what certain games I liked did to motivate players to reach a goal. In fact, what did games do well in general to get players to do anything? The rest, as they say, is history. About 2 years ago, I hit upon something that could fix the conclusion of my game. At this point, I had fallen a little out of love with making videos for the channel, and instead was finding new creative pursuits doing work for other YouTube video makers. This led me to playing tabletop role-playing games with a few of them, and that return to games had actually renewed some of my interest in working on the project, as did the fact that I could now feasibly prototype it using Tabletop Simulator. As I could only play the physical version of the game whenever I returned back home, or had the confidence to play with strangers, this digital board game sim actually opened up a lot of opportunities for sending the prototype to people who are a lot more analytical about game design than I. At this point, the game was just room cards, monsters, and treasures. Health points were removed entirely because it ended up drastically affecting the experience players had. Those with a lot of health points weren't challenged, those with a little were, and when they died it was left in the air whether they had to remember what their full HP was or if they rolled for HP again. Instead, it was replaced with the shield card. Like the room cards, it could be flipped over to denote a mechanical change. And this was inspired somewhat by Dark Souls. When a shield is fixed, it breaks, absorbing a full hit from an enemy and ends a player's turn. Players then had a choice of whether to fight the enemy again next turn with a broken shield, at the risk of getting KO'd, losing their hand of cards where they laid, and having to return back to the start. Or they could use one of their turns to fix their shield and give themselves another fighting chance. As I was working away at a new job, I had come up with something to motivate players leaving the dungeon. Unbelievably, this was inspired by Wario Land 4's Frog Switch. The countdown deck. As the name suggests, it was a suite of cards printed with numbers that denoted passing time, and at the beginning of each turn, players had to draw a card from the countdown deck. These weren't just the same number either. Sometimes it'd be 1 second, 2 seconds, or -1 second. Occasionally there'd be a card stuck in there that made the players all have to fight a monster. Once these cards equaled 10 or above, the dungeon would close, and anyone caught inside would be eliminated. This was the exact thing players needed to leave. There'd be an uncertainty whether they could because they'd need to roll a dice to move through old rooms, and at this point they may have grown a dungeon large enough that getting around took its time. So there was no reason to stick around and duel. I couldn't decide whether it would be kinder to have countdown cards draw every round, or whether every turn was more fun. But at this point, it felt like the game had figured itself out, and it had only taken me 4 years to get there. So that's it, the game's good to go, right? Well, not quite, because once again, the project ended up on the back burner as I found myself working on other projects. This included becoming a GM for the first time, getting back into video making, starting a tabletop podcast, and eventually finding myself here. During this time, the game was prototyped by others, and they came back with interesting feedback. Some I tried to apply to later versions, and some I couldn't. Perhaps the problem was, because I had sat with the game for so long, I was kind of bored with it. Any potential it had was unfortunately gone because I had played so many versions of it in different states. I wanted to create a board game that people would be playing again and again, just like the classics. And yeah, I couldn't quite reconcile the fact that it was only fun to play with the prototypes, but didn't quite get beyond that. More importantly, I knew that the moment I finished it, it wasn't actually going to be finished. Because then came publishing a physical version, and that required looking for a publisher, or going to Kickstarter and finding a printer, and so on. The last thing I've done with the game was update its rules to a more readable format. At some point I should rework its room tiles so the doors look a bit more like doors. I should also try and figure out if I can add a bit more spice to it. But at this point, I don't know what. Making games isn't easy. If you manage to make it all the way through to this point in the video, that much should be certain. But that's not to say it's impossible. After all, people have been making games for centuries, and it doesn't look like that's slowing down. As I said, the only reason this channel continues to stop and start is because video games keep coming out. Not to mention great role-playing games and mobile games and board games that this channel sometimes dips into. I also don't want this video to be a cautionary tale against making games yourself. If you're out there and have always wanted to, the best time to start is now. Although this game may continue to stop and start like the channel, I have been making baby steps elsewhere. I finished 2 tabletop campaigns and 2 seasons of a podcast, and although they may have been derived from other people's work, I've added enough tweaks and changes to them that they could be considered their own products. In fact, since the end of Quest and Show Season 2, I've been working on GM rules so that people can use my Quest and Show system at home, if they want to run their own one-off adventures, or use it for the basis of something brand new. And I think it's that rejuvenated creativity from Quest and Show and even making videos for the channel that made me want to come back to this project. I could have waited until I had an audience large enough to take an interest in some vain hope of turning it into a Kickstarter, but I know that's fleeting. Because like I said all the way back at the beginning of the video, a lot of lessons have been learned from making this game, and it's about time I get around to them. Not just for you at home, but as a reminder for myself. Perfect is the enemy of done. This is something that with my newest videos I've figured out, and it's even something that has permeated through Quest and Show. The reason that this game has been in development for over 5 years is the fact that I couldn't be happy with any of the work I'd done. In hindsight, there was plenty from all the prototypes I could have used elsewhere. Those room cards could have been useful for tabletop games. Those little characters I could have used in animation. In fact, some of the skills I picked up from making the game have paid off elsewhere. But having gone blind trying to reach a hypothetical perfection that, especially at the time, I wouldn't have reached, kept the game in a perpetual state of development that ended up burning me out. Instead, it's often more gratifying having anything tangible to show for your efforts. At the end of the day, a good product is better than a great idea, especially when there's an end audience. And the thing is, and something I need to keep reminding myself of, is that you are not alone. The main reason I wanted this project to be done by one person wasn't for the prestige, but it was because I knew I could rely on myself for most of the important details. This applies too for nearly every video I make. I write the scripts, do the VO, graphics, game capture, and editing myself, and only source music and some game clips from elsewhere. But some of the best stuff I've made this year has been thanks to the help of others, whether that's having people check my scripts to fix them up, or additional VO help, or even commission music. One of the best projects I did this year just required me to manage others. I can say wholeheartedly that what inspired my return to video making was finding a group of people who have been incredibly supportive not just of the work I do, but of their community in general. Surround yourself with people like this, ones who will be honest enough to tell you where you're going wrong, but kind enough to tell you how you can improve. So even if you want to keep all the elements of the game to yourself, prototyping is important to know when you're out of the picture it's still going to function. And there's a lot of great game designers out there who'd be more than happy to help you shape your game into something that even you didn't know could be possible. And if you're ever stuck for ideas, remember that inspiration is everywhere. Like I said, my idea for the game came from wanting to combine two things I liked into something that was a little more my speed. A lot of game design can be found in these areas. Make a better version of something that exists, or combine two things together. Better is obviously subjective, but that too has its audience. Or you could try and take a feeling or idea that's yet to be done and make it tangible. There's a great suite of lyric games that exist to put a player in a headspace or give them a unique challenge to overcome. And you might have a favourite sport, a mundane job or weird life event that could find itself manifesting as an idea. The square and modular cards of the game were inspired by my first year living in a city built out of roundabouts. The Minotaur and Minotaur were added because of their funny naming scheme. Rock Paper Scissors became a feature because of Alex Kidd, and the fact that all players have hands to go with their dice and cards. It was something that could be added without having to add anything extra to the box. Don't forget though, that making games is expensive, and a little tiresome, so it's good to keep to a schedule. If I had to take into account how much time I spent on the project, it would work out to 32 days of development in total. If I paid myself minimum wage for the time I did, the game would come to £2,048, or just over 800 pints of Wetherspoons. And that isn't accounting if I had paid my playtesters, or factoring how much I spent on printed and cut prototypes. This too goes along with done being better than perfect and working within your limitations. If you know you can turn around a project in a particular time, then cut yourself a time to work in. That limitation may end up breathing a creativity you didn't expect. Also, don't be afraid to set a low goal to clear. In the case of this game, having a completed version is a solid milestone to hit. Considering Kickstarter is a little out of my league right now, as is finding a publisher for the idea. But when that time comes, I'm sure I could start networking with those in the know, and prepare where I can to turn a prototype into a physical product. Also, making something easy is very hard. In order to create a game that anyone can pick up and play, language and instruction is key. I've had the fortune of learning a little of this by doing instructional design, but you're still never going to know who is going to play your game. But yours isn't the first game that exists, so you don't need to laboriously explain the rules and systems for everything. However, legibility and conciseness will make the difference in how well received your game will be. It took me a while to get the language right for my title, and even now there's a lot more levity that could be added to match the lighter tone of the game in general. What happens after this video is still unknown. I'd like to continue polishing up the game, but I need to apply some restraint to stop myself completely reworking the title. There's plenty of ideas I could apply from my own experience as a game master and tabletop player, especially from Quest and Show, and plenty of games I've played since to learn from. But right now I can improve the experience by greasing those inbuilt mechanics and polishing the language of my rules. And I'll have to do all that while also making videos for the channel, of course. Whether the game will appear again in video form, I'm not sure. If it does, I'll likely tell you what it's called. Not because I haven't got a name yet, but more so the worry that it might once again end up with the name of another game I can't trademark. At the point I do figure something out though, it will be ready for a more widespread test, and hopefully a move out of development and into production. Like I said at the beginning of the video, some failed artists find resolution in criticism. This isn't to tear down work out of jealousy, but rather to analyse the elements of what makes a great piece of art. While I don't consider myself a failure, I do think that this channel has been a project born out of figuring out a solution to a game that, after nearly 6 years, hasn't bore into something I am totally happy with. Perhaps my standards are too high, or I've spent so long with it that I can't stand the sight of it. Maybe I'm still a day away from figuring out that missing piece that'll make it work. Or haven't met the right person who knows what it is. Perhaps the game will continue to be something that'll take shape as and when it needs to. Or I can take those things I built to create it and rework it into new projects. After all, if only you knew that the game existed in the first place, who can call you out on reupholstering old ideas? Importantly, I hope this video has given you an appreciation that making anything creative isn't easy, but it can be incredibly rewarding. If it wasn't for this game, I wouldn't have started the channel, and met a lot of cool creative people and done a lot of cool creative things. And I hope this video might lead me onto more creative ventures, either for something else, or for the game. Let me know in the comments about any cool things you've been working on, and any difficulties you came across. We're all in this together, after all, and the best we can do is uplift each other, even after the next upload.